Terrific panel now to follow. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to stick David Kramer on you. Ladies and gentlemen, please come in. We're going to get started now. We have a terrific panel now. This is on what is going on with Ukraine. What is the situation and the future? This has been a tremendously dynamic year in Ukraine with a new political movement, presidential elections, parliamentary elections, new president, now a new government, new prime minister, and an extraordinary amount of momentum that goes into driving domestic reform and change and fighting corruption in Ukraine and into addressing the conflict with Russia in the Donbass and ultimately Crimea. So for that, we have a terrific panel of experts here to address this from a variety of perspectives. And leading us through all this is my very good friend, Executive Vice President of the Atlantic Council, Damon Wilson.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Volker. It's working terrific. Welcome back to day two for this conversation. A focus on Ukraine, and a focus on Ukraine, now what, which is the theme of this entire conference. I just wanted to start before I bring in an incredible panel here by saying I think it's really appropriate that we are starting day two, this panel, with a discussion about Ukraine. Yesterday, we're in Georgia, hot political season, a lot of focus on what's going here in Georgia. But as Kurt said, it's important to broaden the aperture, to look at the neighborhood, look what's happening. And there's some pretty dramatic things unfolding, particularly in Ukraine. We're going to pick up on the conversation that Ia just had with former Secretary General Rasmussen, someone who's been a stalwart voice and champion in support of freedom in Ukraine. And we're going to dwell a little bit on this issue because if you can step away from the immediate back and forth of what's happening in Tbilisi, the biggest geopolitical question in play in Europe today is whether Ukraine anchors itself in the West. And so for this conversation, I couldn't be more pleased to have an extraordinary group of people up here to talk about this from different perspectives. I'm delighted to be joined on my left by Svetlana Zalishuk, who has been a former member of Parliament, who served on the Foreign Affairs Committee, the Parliamentary Assembly, the Council of Europe, and was chair of the Subcommittee of European and Euro-Atlantic Integration, a long-time background in civil society, NGOs, and journalism. General Phil Breedlove, one of my great mentors and someone who inspires me, obviously former NATO commander, SACIR, commander U.S. European Command. He's now a distinguished professor at Georgia Tech, and I'm proud to say one of my bosses is an Atlantic Council board director. Ambassador John Herbst, who has been an extraordinary champion serving as Atlantic Council director of our Eurasia Center, champion for Ukraine, obviously a former ambassador to Ukraine, but also a former ambassador to Uzbekistan and a senior official dealing with this entire region. And James Nixie, who is a longtime voice at Chatham House as the head of the Russia and Eurasia program, who brings a deep understanding of this region and how it's viewed and seen throughout the transatlantic community. So Svetlana, we're here to talk about Ukraine. So I want to start with the Ukrainian in the conversation. And, you know, Ambassador Volker, Kurt just teed this up by saying it's a moment. It's really a moment in Ukraine. This election was extraordinary, the two elections. President Zelensky taking office, and we've seen some pretty dramatic steps to someone who just not long ago was a complete unknown. But we've been through a cycle of Ukraine since its independence of heightened expectations, the potential we see, and yet the disappointment and execution delivery. And so how do you see this moment, now what, as someone who's been in civil society, journalism, political actor, as expectations begin to increase for President Zelensky, are they going to be dashed, or is this a moment to be hopeful?
Good morning, everyone. Is it working? Yes? Working well? Well, first of all, I would like to thank organizers for this amazing conference. And in particular, I would like to thank for...
I'm going to check one more time just to make
not.
sure. Your voice projects beautifully, so we couldn't tell.
Now it should work. Yeah, right. So I'll start over to thank the organizers, and in particular I would like to thank organizers for having this panel, which is a focus on Ukraine. However, I would like to say that there is a problem that I noted during this conference, that this key question that was put by Nino Yevgenidze in front of all of us hasn't been really answered. And this is an important question, and I suspect that we avoid answering it because it's like a self-preservation instinct, you know, to answer the question, now what? But for Ukraine, it's even more important question because we have to answer about some crucial, fundamental things that other countries are fortunate, are lucky not to answer. And I'm talking about our territorial integrity, and I'm talking about our sovereignty. I'm talking about 300,000 Crimean Tatars that live in annexed Crimea Peninsula, which we don't have an answer how to deoccupy the territories, how to give the right to indigenous people to have the right to talk their language, to live their life without repressions, and so on. Moreover, I'd like to say that while answering those crucial questions, Ukraine is sometimes not helped by our friends. I understand that we have to answer questions that put in front of us by our enemy, but there are more questions coming from our partners and from our friends. For example, a question coming from Germany. There is a Nord Stream 2, a gas pipeline detouring Ukraine and bringing gas from Russia to Ukraine directly, which creates the problem of the energy security, not only to Ukraine, but to the whole region, to the whole Eastern Europe, to 10 European Eastern countries, that is worried how this gas leverage will be used by an aggressor in the future. We also have a question from, for example, Italy and Austria about lifting up the sanctions from Russia in a situation that none of the obligations that have been imposed on Russia by UN Security Council, by other international important platforms, haven't been really fulfilled. We have a question from France with the newest Macron's foreign policy strategy. He has recently said to his diplomats that they do not consider that the enemy of their friend is necessarily an enemy to France. And if you put this new principle of the foreign policy into the very difficult international context, I'm not sure that it's going to work. We also have a question from US as well. I'm talking about bringing Russia and intention to bring Russia back to G7 platform, G8 platform. I don't think that it's helpful at the moment for Ukraine to deal with all of the problems. However, on the positive note, we had just presidential and parliamentary elections. And I have to say that I'm pretty hopeful when it comes to the internal politics of what's going to happen in the nearest time in Ukraine. From what we see, Mr. Zelensky, courageous man, I believe in his human being, good motivations to change things. We have already draft laws to change the judicial system. He already changed the general prosecution team. He put in place a new general prosecutor who started to clean the general prosecution office. We have also new government. I would say that it's the cleanest government since the independence of Ukraine. Young technocrat government that is very promising. At least at the entrance they have this status. I hope they will prove this status and at the exit as well. So here I think that we have quite a hope. And on the last note, you know, I believe that this question, now what? It's not a rhetoric question. And we have to have an answer. And I also want to quote one of the men that we we were commemorating his memory here, right? John McCain, he said, our shared values define us more than our differences. And acknowledging those shared values can see us through our challenges today if we have the wisdom to trust in them again. We will be able, as Ukraine, as Georgia, to answer all those big challenges in front of us only if we have a shared master plan of the future in front of us. If we craft our own small plans, there will be no chance to overcome those challenges.
Thank you very much, Svetlana. So it's a sense of optimism. But you kicked off with some of the questions that come from Ukraine's friends internationally because we've been through cycles of disappointment before. So I want to turn to General Breedlove. You as a NATO commander and now in your role now have been one of the strongest voices, a key actor in ensuring that the West stood with Ukraine in a difficult time. But as Svetlana's questions implied, there remains some skepticism in many of the transatlantic community about whether Ukraine's really worth the investment, worth the bet. And we also watch a dynamic historically where the Kremlin has sort of learned we will ease ourselves back into business as usual if they just bide their time. So how do you see sort of the situation that we're going into when Svetlana is asking for a strategy, a master plan, as you call it, and yet we do have calls from key capitals, from Washington, Paris, that could imply perhaps it's time to get back to business as usual with Moscow?
Well, first, thanks for the opportunity to speak and also for the organizers. What a great way to center a conference. And I agree as well. Now what? I mean, we've got some things we have to do, and I believe Svetlana and others have already outlined my entire first point, which is I think the most important thing is that we in the West, really the whole world, but we certainly in the West, need to remain resolute on how we see what has to happen in the future for Ukraine. We are not seeing the promises of Minsk in the beginning, and I believe that Minsk, while it has had some small benefits, which I believe will be discussed later, has stalled and is making no progress for us now. And we have to, in the West, remain resolute in keeping the focus on the intransigence of Russia. Russia used military force to change internationally recognized borders when they took Crimea. Russia used military force to change internationally recognized borders when they invaded the Donbass and have propped up the group that is in there now. And so we have to hold Russia accountable for these actions. And we need to keep focus, and you hit it right on the head. We cannot go back to business as usual. Yes, we need to engage Russia. We don't want to fight. I don't think they want to fight us. But we have to find a path forward that first stands on the principle that changing borders with force is unacceptable. That's what they've done in this country. That's what they've done in Ukraine, and we need to keep that focus.
General Breedlove, thank you so much. I want to come back and parse a couple of those issues on Minsk and others. But first, I want to bring in Ambassador Herbst and James. And I want to ask you to put your analytical hats on. You've been following this region for a long time. We've gone through highs, we've gone through lows. It feels like we're back in a high at this moment. John, you've sort of framed this and talked a lot about how Ukraine performs in this two-front war, one against Russian aggression, one against corruption and reform at home. So how do you actually see this analytically now playing out? Now what in Ukraine?
Damon, thank you, and thanks for the organizers for this extraordinary conference. There used to be talk in Washington from time to time about Ukraine fatigue, the notion that Washington had become tired with the sorts of problems one runs into in Ukraine. You talked about the highs and lows. Well, I can tell everyone in this audience that I've been now working again on not just Ukraine, but Eurasia at the Atlantic Council for nearly 5.5 years. And Ukraine fatigue is dead. In other words, Washington interest in Ukraine remains exceptionally high, and it's not going away. And there are two reasons for this. First, General Breedlove talked about the need to take Russia to account. Or I would say not so much Russia, but the Kremlin. And I would distinguish between the Kremlin's aggressive policies and the Russian people. And the reason why, ultimately, we need to take the Kremlin to account is that Moscow's war against the Ukrainian people is part of a broader campaign against us. The Kremlin has an avowedly revisionist foreign policy designed to upend the order that was created in Europe, not just at the end of the Cold War, but even at the end of World War II. For all of its evil, the Soviet Union did not change the boundaries, in Europe at least, after World War II. Although, let's be clear about it, the Soviet Union was a greater threat to the United States than Putin's Russia is. Ultimately, because it had both a truly nasty ideology and it had greater power. But Putin's objectives, which he has pursued in a fairly consistent, albeit ad hoc way, is to weaken the United States, to weaken the transatlantic alliance, to weaken the EU, and to weaken the individual states in Europe. The front line of the Kremlin's war against us, a cool war for us, is the hot war in Ukraine. And our interest is to make sure that Moscow loses in Donbass. This is a vital interest to us. And this is understood in Washington in virtually all precincts, virtually all. The second point comes up where Svetlana was talking in great depth at the second part of her statement, which is what's happening internally in Ukraine. The 5 years since Maidan have been years of true progress in Ukraine, and former President Poroshenko deserves a lot of credit, not just as a war leader, but also overseeing reform. We spent too much time talking about the inadequacies of reform under him as a way to encourage more progress. But keep in mind that Svetlana is no longer in the Rada, and she comes from the class of reformers, the Euro-optimists of the old government. And she gave a ringing endorsement of the new President Zelensky, who won as a reformer, as a crusader against corruption. And in almost all, not quite all cases, his appointments have been exceptional. And I've spoken to many of the people who are part of his team, some of whom were reformers under President Poroshenko, and they all said they are joining the Zelensky team because they believe he's for real. And that day in the Rada, last week, a week and a half ago, where they introduced all this legislation, a truly extraordinary step. Doesn't mean it's going to be easy, but the reform process in Ukraine, which received a serious jolt forward 4.5 years ago, has received at least as large of a jolt within the last 2 weeks. Last point, highlighted both by General Breedlove and Svetlana, which is the role of the West is critical here. The Ukrainian people know that they're in the fight of their life, and they have stepped up. Moscow thought it would easily create Novorossiya from Luhansk in the northeast of Ukraine down through Odessa in the southwest of Ukraine. They failed because the Ukrainian people, including, to remind our friends to the north, the Russian speakers in Ukraine, fought Kremlin aggression. Ukrainian people will win this war, and Putin will lose as long as the West's support remains strong. The sanctions, the military assistance, and Ukraine will fight and win this war. Thank you.
Thank you, Ambassador Herbst. James, please pick this up. I mean, you're coming from a perspective in London where, how do you see what's playing out in Ukraine? Where do you differ perhaps with some of your colleagues up here? But could you also offer a bit of a European perspective of the view of this? You're in the midst of sitting in a place that's going through Brexit. We see big debates about the future of the European Union, lack of ambition for expansion of its borders. What's the European-British appetite here to step in and support President Zelensky?
Okay, thanks for the Brexit question straight off. Hospital pass, as they say in rugby. And thank you for the organisers again, David, Kurt, and Nino, especially. You show us all how to do it. Yeah, well, I've been looking at the map as well, and I see our former Prime Minister is out on her own at the top, which is very sort of indicative of where the UK is right now. Brexit obviously gives Russia a louder voice because it sows discord, and Russia feeds off the rotting flesh in Europe, and there is quite a lot of rotting flesh. It's hard to talk about Europe as a whole anymore. There are, Svetlana alluded to it with Germany, but let's look at Macron's recent statements, look at the Finnish Foreign Minister's recent statements, the Greeks, the Italians, the Hungarians, as always. There are as many naysayers as there are Ukrainian supporters in Europe these days, and so I probably am a slight glass half empty person there, because I do see that solidarity, which has been impressive on sanctions, and I think it's the only thing I really admire Minsk for, because Minsk is the one way to keep sanctions. I don't see as much use of it as anyone. I basically believe Minsk was written in the Kremlin anyway, but the solidarity which has been so impressive so far is beginning to fall away as different regimes take over in Europe, different governments come on in. In my country in particular, actually I'm not quite so pessimistic in spite of what I said before about Brexit, partly because I know Boris Johnson got burnt quite badly as Foreign Secretary in Moscow, and when he left under some sort of a cloud as Foreign Secretary, he was asked what his biggest regret was, and it was that I was too naive about Russia. So that does give me some hope. On the other hand, Boris Johnson's, the UK government may be forced to lessen its values as it looks for new markets. The British ambassador yesterday, I don't know if he's still here today, but he said that the UK stands behind Georgia. And I think that's fair, but it only goes so far, because the life expectancy of this current government may be 5 weeks. And it's not beyond the realms of possibility by any means that you have a Prime Minister Corbyn, then I think that the ambassador's statement is not true. Then I think that we will not necessarily stand behind Georgia or Ukraine because the ugly ideology is so far removed from what it is now. Right now, we're kind of, broadly speaking, on board with the good guys, with the Scandinavians and the Balts. But Corbyn is I think should be a big worry to everybody, because he is so far out of the mainstream, so far beyond any left-wing Scandinavian politician. He's a complete outlier. And if you Google something like, I don't know, Corbyn, Morningstar, Russia, Morningstar being the communist newspaper of the UK, then I think you would find that this is a very worrying man indeed. I'll stop there.
So the volatility of British politics can make us feel bullish on the stability and optimism of Ukrainian politics today. Let me come back on a couple of points before I bring in the audience. A couple of you referred to Minsk. I want to ask about Minsk, but also ask about that in the context of Zelensky's strategy vis-a-vis Mr. Putin. It sounds like you're sort of questioning the validity or relevance of Minsk today, General Breedlove. If you could unpack that a little bit. What is a more viable, as Svetlana asked for, what is a more viable strategy to think about peace in Donbass, but not just a peace, but a restoration of Donbass, Crimea into Ukraine, if not Minsk?
I believe that, and I have said this before, that we in the West sort of threw Minsk over the bow and asked Germany and France to sort of move it forward. I think that's much too small an audience for this big a task. This is a process that needs to be owned by the West and needs to have much bigger and more involved countries, as well as France and Germany, great countries as well. But we need to have a bigger involvement and press behind Minsk. And I think Svetlana made some really good points, which I'd like to highlight, that I think Minsk could help with. And that is, we have, I think, opportunity in this new president. I believe he has the mandate of the people. It's been demonstrated. And I think that we, the West, through Minsk and through our bilateral relationships, need to give this president the opportunities to succeed, to back him in the way that he is making his decisions and trying to move this forward. And so I just really believe in the main frame that Minsk is flat, and nothing's happening that I see that's good right now. And if we don't reinflate that tire with some more energy and some more big hitting people, that we're not going to get where we need to get.
Well, Ambassador Herbst, John, some analysts had been quite concerned about what they would perceive as the potential naivete of Zelensky vis-a-vis Mr. Putin. How have you seen his handling of the challenge he faces from the Kremlin, and how should Minsk fit into that strategy?
Oh, I think that President Zelensky has earned a solid B+ on foreign policy this early in his tenure. First, he came into office, it's clear, with the thought that he might be able to reach out to the Kremlin to develop a certain understanding. And we saw that with two ideas. One, a referendum on relations with Russia, and the other, a referendum on NATO membership. Both of those ideas were floated. They were shot down by a large majority of the Ukrainian public, and they disappeared. So he also showed flexibility, but that was a signal to Moscow. What he got in exchange for that signal was the Putin provocation of issuing passports to people in occupied Donbass. And Zelensky's a quick learner. He continued to reach out to the Kremlin, but he did two things which jolted Moscow. First, in response to the passport provocation, he used his skills as a professional entertainer to put Putin on his rear end. He said, who wants a passport to Russia? It's a passport to having no human rights. And Putin was embarrassed and uncharacteristically silent. That was point one. Point two, Zelensky showed some steel when he seized the Russian tanker used in the Straits of Kerch provocation in July. That was a message to Moscow that Zelensky could also take the offensive. I think all of these things, which demonstrated the ability to learn and the ability to take a calculated risk, is what led to the prisoner exchange which everyone was celebrating in Ukraine last week. Not an unalloyed victory. I mean, the Russians got back the guy who was involved in the shoot-down of MH17, a guy, by the way, who the Ukrainians got because the SBU, the Intelligence Service of Ukraine, secreted him out of Russian-occupied Donbass, a great, great paramilitary operation. So yes, the Ukrainians gave him back, but they got back their prisoners, they got some of their prisoners, they got back the sailors, and it confirmed a campaign promise that Zelensky made for his people. So it was a victory for Zelensky. So on balance, he's done a pretty good job.
So I want to ask one more question before I come to the audience to bring it back to a Georgian audience. I'm sometimes struck by how people outside of Tbilisi and Kyiv often think about and work on this region, Ukraine, Georgia, Moldova, what's happening here together, and think of this in a framework and how they relate to each other. I'm struck when you're standing in Kyiv or Tbilisi that they don't think about each other. There are relatively limited coordination, ties, strategy we've had in some of the meetings here with officials saying, Ukraine's not really relevant for us, or we want to stay away from that. Solana, let me start with you. Why is what's happening in Ukraine relevant if you're sitting in Tbilisi? Why don't we see more intentional coordination strategy between Georgians and Ukrainians? There are a lot of Georgians in Ukraine, but what about here?
Thank you for this question. Well, first, I'll start with the fact that we traveled together to the occupation line in Tbilisi region 2 days ago. And while I was listening to the representative of the security service, I found that, you know, I didn't hear anything new, because everything what is happening here is happening in Ukraine as well. Russian FSB is acting like by the manual, you know, it's like a copy-paste practices of the occupation. In Georgia, in Ukraine, in Transnistria, in other countries. And you're right, I think there is not enough of effort and joint efforts in order to counteract this aggression. I think there were some political internal things, and it was connected, well, Saakashvili, new government here. So I don't want to go deeper in that. But what you are right about, that there is this need to enhance our relationship and our efforts to counteract Russian aggression, and to show to the world that without a joint effort also with the international community, it's not going to work. I want to comment also on Minsk agreement, if I may. Just two very quick points. The problem with the Minsk agreement is, first, Ukraine demands the rule of the international law. And we are trying to play by the rules while Russia is playing with the rules. And that's why we are doomed to lose all the time. We will be playing a little bit their game all the time. And second problem with the Minsk is that Minsk in 2015, because it was developed in 2015, if it was realized, if it was fulfilled by the end of 2015, it would be completely different Minsk that exists now. Because, for example, the elections that should have happened by the end of 2015 would have happened with voters, completely different voters even, because thousands of people, hundreds of thousands, well, yes, hundreds of thousands of people moved to Ukraine, to Russia, to elsewhere. Also, standards in terms of media, you know, those people for 5 years, they haven't heard from Ukrainian government, because Ukrainian media are completely blocked on those territories, and so on and so forth. So Minsk is a completely different plan at that point and now.
James, do you just have a brief view on this Tbilisi-Kiev connection? Your analysis from London, you look at this region together. Here, those connections aren't always as strong.
Yeah, I think you're right to identify this, and it's been brought up a few times yesterday, that there's not enough interaction between the Georgians and the Ukrainians when you'd think they have so much in common. But of course, it's like a Russian opposition. I mean, they all hate each other, and that's obviously not true for Georgians and Ukrainians, but they do find it difficult to get on with each other. I think partly because they're sort of obsessed with their own selves. So that degree of cooperation has always been lacking amongst all of the states around Russia's periphery, to be honest with you. There's not, I mean, they talk a good game about cooperation, but the reality is there's not as much interaction, and there's not much pooling of resources as there ought to be. All I would say is that I do think that the Ukraine situation, the invasion, the annexation, did help Georgia, because it brought the Georgia situation into a starker relief. Having said that, then Georgia does always suffer by being further away, in the minds of most Europeans, less European than Ukraine is. It's more alien to the European mind, I'm sorry to say. I know that's not true in reality, but I think at the popular level, at the popular mindset, then Georgia is just that bit further removed than Ukraine is.
That's partly why this conference matters, to bring so many guests here to Georgia to prove otherwise. All right, we started a few minutes late, but David has told me we're going to try to end on time. So I want to turn to the audience. I'd like to take a few questions. Let's start here with this woman here. We'll come forward to Batu, and then, yes, these three, we'll take these three. Introduce yourself, a quick question, and direct it to anybody up here on stage.
Good morning, Tinatin Japaridze, Columbia University Harriman Institute. We've talked a lot about Russia's kinetic actions in the region, but very little about non-kinetic actions. And obviously Ukraine was attacked in the cyber realm, and so was Georgia, but obviously not at the same rate. I was wondering, is there any way that our two countries can cooperate in the cyber domain? And if so, is there anything that could be done perhaps with the United States or Great Britain, taking perhaps from the Estonian model? They've been really fantastic at building up their cyber capabilities. Thank you.
Terrific, good question. Cyber, hybrid, and let's come forward if we can. I was going to do Bato as well.
Okay, a lot of thanks. I have a question to Ms. Svetlana, and I will continue already asked question concerning Georgian-Ukrainian coordination. Are you going to plan any kind of platform concerning Georgian and Ukrainian cooperation on not only governmental but also on non-governmental level? There are some existing cooperation and platforms, but it's not enough because our problems are difficult, and today we both are struggling against Russia. So thank you.
Please pass the mic forward, Ambassador Kutelia.
Thank you, Batu Kuteli, Atlantic Council of Georgia. My question is also related to the cooperation. Just a brief historical flashback of the positive experience of Georgia, Ukraine, Moldova, and even Azerbaijan cooperating. That was a CFA adaptation process, and that led then the organization Guam. It was a successful process for the Russian military base withdrawal, provided that at that time there was a clearly demonstrated American and European interest to support this cooperation. So to return this question to the American panelists, General Breedlove and John Herbst, do we have a chances to have some kind of coordinated US policy to the region? As it has been mentioned, the fulcrum or center of gravity from Baltic Sea is now moving back to the Black Sea.
So let me pass it to this gentleman here, and then in the next round I'll pick you up. So please, to this gentleman right with his hand raised. Yes, and then we'll come back to the panel, and I'll catch another round.
Yes, I'm the ambassador of Brazil. I make a quite different question. You know that in Latin America we have a complicated problem with Venezuela. Now, Venezuela has just moved Russian-made missiles to the boundary of Colombia. About the situation in Venezuela, President Trump keeps saying that all options are on the table. And I would like to know from you how you could see if there is any link between the situation there and here. So if any move United States make about Venezuela can have a reflex on the Ukrainian, Georgian, Moldovan, this area situation. If they are kind of a Cold War is back about checks and balance, how you see if there is any link between the situation in the two regions?
Thank you. Fascinating question. I'm delighted you asked that, and happy Independence Day to Brazil, by the way. So let me come back to the panel. Non-kinetic, cyber, hybrid war, Ukrainian-Georgian coordination, prospects for U.S., EU helping to catalyze more strategy across the Guam countries, and this Venezuela link where I know, John, you've done some work on that. So let's start with you, Svetlana. Don't pick up on all of them, just a couple of them, and leave time for the round.
First of all, I would like to touch upon coordination between Georgia and Ukraine and what Batu also asked. I think that examples when we were successful as Ukrainian in terms of international politics and security shows that we were actually going together with Georgia. And mentioning action plan, NATO action plan, you know, we didn't get it in 2008, but we were very close to it. And lobbying for membership action plan was possible because we also was in this camp, in this group of, post-Soviet countries, transition countries that are fighting for the security area and for transformation. As well, DCFTA, association agreement, within the Eastern Partnership, there are different 6 countries, you know, and not all of the countries want this European integration and Euro-Atlantic integration. But because Georgia and Ukraine were very close partners, it also helped us to create a group dynamics which helped us actually to achieve results, and association agreement and free trade agreement was a success, you know. And also now I think we have this also a group dynamic, separate group dynamic within the Eastern Partnership. So I also would like to answer with this.
Just briefly.
It's the same question same answer to the question of whether we need this coordination. Yes, and yesterday we met the president of Georgia, Salome Zurabishvili, and she told me personally that she wants our relation to be closer. And they are planning already the visits between Mr. Zelensky and President Zurabishvili. I hope it will help to enhance the cooperation, including on the non-governmental level, of course.
Terrific. General Breedlove, perhaps the non-kinetic as well as the strategy here.
Two quick offers. First of all, I agree we need to be working together on this cyber and hybrid problem. It's a tough one. And NATO, of course, is now wrestling with when does this become Article 5 and how to define among itself when there would be either cyber or kinetic response to cyber attack. And so I think, but I would say let's open our eyes to even bigger things. When Russia attacks, it attacks in an all-of-government, all-of-country way. It attacks diplomatically, it attacks in information, it attacks militarily, it uses its energy to attack economically. And what do we in the West do? We always just reply with economic tools to punish them. And I think we need to open our eyes and get our eyes up on the horizon and think all of government reply to all of government attack. The second thing I will quickly say is on this cooperation, I believe we've missed an opportunity. We haven't talked about the external audience. If these countries, which are under attack by Russia, were to put their message and their voice together to the exterior world, I know in my country it would make a big difference. It's a little easier for people to say, well, I don't know about Georgia. Well, I don't know about Ukraine. Well, I don't know about Moldova. But if we had a unified voice from these countries that are under attack that was being presented to Joe and Sally Sixpack in Kansas, they might hear it a little better.
Thank you, General. John, please pick up Venezuela as well.
Okay. I would endorse what Phil just said, that there is great value in Moldova, Ukraine, and Georgia collectively addressing the problem that they face. There was a good initiative of the parliaments of the three countries going back 18 or so months ago, and the three speakers came to Washington in summer of last year, and they met with Speaker Ryan precisely because they were all together. I would also add that by and large, despite all of the peculiarities, American policy recognizes the problems of the Kremlin approach to what it calls its near abroad, the failure to recognize the sovereignty of these countries, and the importance of developing a policy across the region. Now, regarding Venezuela, a little advertisement. There will be an Atlantic Council paper coming out on Russian policy in Venezuela and what we should do about it that I co-drafted with Jason Marzock. And the basic points are these. As part of Putin's efforts to challenge the rules-based order globally and to make life more difficult for the United States wherever it can do so at a reasonable cost, the Kremlin has been backing up the authoritarian and losing fast popularity Maduro regime in Caracas. This was a very high-profile issue in Washington going back 6 or 7 months ago when President Trump famously said that no options are off the table. That remains the American policy, but the temperature has dropped. I can tell you that the policy in Washington remains firmly against, let's say, easing out Maduro. The U.S. recognized Guaido, the leader of the opposition, as the true leader of the country, but does not want to make the already existing crisis worse. So this requires a certain amount of dexterity, which involves, one, keeping all options on the table, but two, trying to see if there's some way to make this crisis ease without a major confrontation.
Thank you, John. James, just a quick addition, because I do want to take a couple more before we wrap.
Two very small points, then. I think the important thing to understand about non-kinetic warfare is that the Russians have always done this, but it's changed. it was always a prelude to war. It was the beginning of the first stage of warfare. Now, it may be that, but it is also instead of. The Russians don't want to go to war. It's expensive, it's messy, they may not win, there's all sorts of problems with that. But with non-kinetic warfare, because it's below that threshold, it's changed in its mentality. The Russians have changed their theory of warfare, and it's now a useful alternative to things that go bang. Very quickly, because the actual question was, what are the similarities between Venezuela and Ukraine, Georgia? And the obvious point is that they are all expressions of Russia's quest for global influence. It's just that in some cases, there's more fertile ground. Venezuela is fertile ground. There's an automatic kindred spiritness between Maduro and Putin. He doesn't have to go very far, like he doesn't have to go very far with Orban in Hungary either. However, of course, Ukraine does mean more to Russia than Venezuela. They could lose Venezuela and they could live it. But the problem is that Russia doesn't feel that it can lose Ukraine and still be Russia. And that's a big problem. So Venezuela is different in that respect.
Thanks, James. I want to do a lightning round and a good tradition to bring in this woman right here in the center, please, and then we'll come up to Colleen. Please, let's go back first to this woman. Raise your hand. Yep.
Thank you again. So my question is related to increasing cooperation.
Introduce yourself, please.
Yes, so Nina Biashvili Institute for European Studies of Tbilisi State University, and when it comes to cooperation, especially Ukraine, Georgia, and Moldova, which are more successful on Eastern Partnership project, I'm again obsessed with this increasing resilience issue. So what's your thought about Black Sea Initiative, Black Sea Synergy Initiative? The question is related to not only increasing cooperation between three of us, but involving also other partners of this region, including Turkey and other Black Sea countries.
Thank you. Black Sea cooperation. Pass the mic forward, please. Colleen.
Colleen Graffi, I'm a law professor with Pepperdine University. Clearly, Zelensky needs to be focused on the Donbas region and Crimea, but I'm wondering if you would recommend that he also turn his gaze to the other side of Ukraine, and that is this rather fluid border between Ukraine and Transnistria, and whether focusing on closing that up would be of strategic importance.
Thanks for bringing that into the equation. May I take a final question? I have not ignored the back. I just haven't seen hands back there, so please, this gentleman.
Thank you.
Good to see you.
I'm ambassador of Ukraine, Igor Dolgov, and it's appropriate to comment and to ask a question.
Thank you, Ambassador.
So we are very good in analyzing Russia's behavior, Putin's policy, and we are not so efficient in countering. Why? And where is the problem? So somebody of panelists mentioned today that two things are important. Putin weakens NATO and EU. One thing. And the second thing, Putin has a veto right. Why? Putin crossed red lines, which are put on that map, at least twice, in Georgia and in Ukraine. What was the reaction? Because crossing red lines, it's very serious. Does it have any connection with veto? He has a veto and the right to cross borders, to occupy territories. Let me remind you what was the reaction of the United States when Saddam crossed the red line, the border of Kuwait. What did you do, Mr. General? How strong was the presence and deployment of US troops in Saudi Arabia? So these things are simple, but they're basic. And
just if you can,
the essence of problem lies in the perception, because until Brussels and Washington do not perceive the problem which continue to be deployed in Ukraine and Georgia, not as a local problem, but as a global problem, we will not find a solution. If Washington and Brussels, EU and NATO, struggle for territories occupied Georgia and Ukraine, as we Georgians and Ukrainians do, to regain our territorial integrity, we would succeed very quickly. Sorry, it was not a question, but a comment. But
Thank you, Ambassador. All right, so I'm going to come back to our panelists. Let me start with James, work in verse. We've got, you don't have to take all of it, but Black Sea, Transnistria, and this idea, as the ambassador pointed, this is a global challenge, and we don't have a global strategy to counter.
Okay, another hospital pass, thank you. Yeah, I mean, okay, let's take Colleen's point first. I think that's a very good point, and it's often ignored. And perhaps with a new Moldovan government, with Plahotniuc out of power, more amenable to Western ideas, then actually there's going to be more maneuverability, more room in which Zelensky can indeed do this. But it's obviously very leaky. That Transnistria is still a mafia entity. That hasn't changed, and it's not likely to change while Russia remains in de facto control. But I think it's very important, but I think it's incredibly difficult to do, bearing in mind the nature of Transnistria right now. On resilience, then I just think that it still goes back to the basic issue of that you need to have a mixture of deterrence and offense. It's not defense on its own is simply not enough. It was brought up yesterday in one of it, but we always seem to be playing defense. And so where it doesn't matter which areas, whether it's Black Sea or anywhere, but I just feel there's this need, we don't do enough thinking about where to push back. I think I'll leave it there really, because I think it wasn't really a look of a question. The last question.
John, please.
One, on the Moldovan or the Transnistria-Ukrainian border. Point of fact, once Moscow went into Donbass, the Ukrainians made that border a real border. And as a result, the Kremlin had problems, and continues to have problems, supplying their forces in Transnistria. The new arrangement in Chisinau is extremely interesting. It seems to be good in terms of domestic developments for the country. Whether or not it is good for their external security, to me, is a question mark. We'll see how the relationship between Maya Sandu and Mr. Dodon plays out.
Black Sea, yes, yes, yes. I said it all the way through my tour as the SACEUR. I continue to say it. This is an incredibly important region. Many of our allies and friends are here. Any efforts that the Black Sea nations take to better coordinate among themselves, I applaud it. But we also need to take a deeper view of the Black Sea from the West. On the last piece about our efficiency in countering Putin, my biggest disappointment is that the West moves far too slowly. We eventually have taken some pretty good, I think still short, but pretty good measures in Ukraine and other places. But we should have taken those measures in the first 5, 6, 7 days. We sent a big message in the slowness of our reply to what happened in the Ukraine. And Mr. Putin, I think, read those messages. We need to be much more resolute in taking action quickly.
On Black Sea, I would like to develop on what Philip has said. In November, we had an attack from Russia on 3 Ukrainian ships in Azov Sea. And it was a violation of the international maritime law. It was violation of the principle of the free navigation of the ships. It was a new page of the aggression from Russia on Ukraine and in general on the rule of the international law. What kind of response did we have? We didn't have a response, because I would expect a Russian fleet would be prohibited to come to the ports of some European nations. I would expect some increase of the sanctions when it comes to, I don't know, some of the initiatives in the Black Sea and so on. We didn't have a proper response, and Putin reads it as an invitation to continue the aggression. That's my understanding of the situation. And second point I'd like to say about Black Sea cooperation, NATO, Eastern Partnership, resilience, and so on. The problem is that the West looks at Ukraine and Georgia sometimes as these kind of victims that needs to be protected, you know. And in a way, that's right. We are the victims of the aggression. But at the same time, if the concept is changed, and if we are looked at as the know-how of the transformation of the post-Soviet area, you know, as the model of this democratic and economic and liberal development, as the entrance point to the transformation of the whole post-Soviet area, then I think it would be a different strategy of how West would react to all of those things. NATO membership action plan, Eastern Partnership, Black Sea Initiative cooperation, and so on and so forth.
Because we have a 4-star with a 2-finger, I'm not going to stop that.
So I want to just pile on to something Svetlana said, and that is we need to understand that there are some victim things here. But let me tell you what we're learning about Russia from the Ukrainian army, about how Russia fights, their new kill chains as it relates to UAVs and artillery and things like that. We are learning from Ukraine about how Russia fights. So yes, we do see some issues of being a victim, but we also need to understand that Ukraine has a bigger army on this line of contact than almost all our European allies have, period. And we need to understand that these are capable forces in Georgia who fought alongside of us in Afghanistan without caveat. And we have great forces in Ukraine that are facing a tough enemy and teaching us how to fight it.
I just want to close this terrific conversation by, we're sitting here in Georgia, we appreciating what happened in Georgia helped inform what happened in Ukraine. And for us to step back and understand that we're here on a fault line of freedom that really is running from the Barents Sea down to the Black Sea. And ultimately, the question is, are you part of a free world or are you slipping into authoritarian kleptocracy? And there's some along that fault line that want a little bit of both. And I think that's one of the fundamental challenges that we have of a strategy to help ensure that the free world includes Georgia, includes Ukraine. And it's by the strategists on this stage and the community in this audience that we'll get there. So please join me in thanking this terrific group, Svetlana, John Breedlove, Ambassador Herbst, James. Well done, well done.